Thanks, Trinity. And for more on inflation, Omicron, and delivery delays, let's turn to our panel. We welcome Hillary Fordwich, president of the Streelmark Business Development Consultants and member of the board for the British American Business Association. We have David Heller, Vice President of Government Affairs for the Truckload Carriers Association, and Michelle Snyder, Partner and Director of Trading Research and Education for MarketGauge.com, and also author of the best-selling book, Plant Your Money Tree, A Guide to Growing Your Wealth. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
So, Hillary, let's start with you. Is the main cause of inflation a mismatch of supply and demand, or is it more from the Fed's devaluing the dollar?
Well, it's a combination of things, and a lot of things are to do actually with, of course, people being paid not to work. If you look at the average trucker where he has no incentive to go to work because he's being paid to stay home, a lot of it is also to do with regulations. For example, let's just take one issue with regards to the trucking issue that was just issued in that recent report there. For example, in California, over half of the trucks could be going back into the LA trucking port because there's a California law on the books banning trucks that are older than 2011 from even entering the port, and non-union owner-operated trucks aren't even entering the port. So you've got those that are older than 2011, those that are non-union. So a lot of this is to do with regulations and people being paid not to work. So I think it's a combination of rules, regulations, and payment. But also, you think about something that Alan Greenspan said. He talked about years ago, monetary policy. He said that monetary policy is like trying to steer the Queen Mary. He said you have to get way ahead of monetary policy in order to be able to steer the boat. And I think that's an issue, that the Fed has to get way ahead of this, because don't forget, we have to tighten regulatory policy in order to slow down this rampant inflation.
Sure. And Michelle, we see that inflation isn't just plaguing the U.S., that 19 European countries that use the euro currency saw inflation rise 5% in December. That's compared to a year earlier, which was the biggest increase on record. So why is this becoming a global issue? Would you blame a large part of it on COVID?
Well, definitely we have to blame a large part of it on COVID. And some of this was already in the works even a couple of years ago before the pandemic, partly because of the monetary policy that we've seen so accommodative globally, with low interest rates, zero interest rates, in some places negative interest rates. And also the fact that we had a lot of just artificial type of moves up in markets globally, although the United States leading the pack. So Omicron kind of it is part of it, but really it started with the overall pandemic. And also, if you just look at crops, there was a reduction in production. That's an interesting thing to say. Way before, because grain prices were going down a lot, oil prices were going down, everything was going down, so that cut back production. So now all of a sudden you get this demand out of control because of the pandemic. And you add all of these things together, they get caught really with their pants down with very low supply. You can't just grow things automatically, it takes time. And the higher demand and now the hoarding mentality on top of that throughout the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely happening. And David, how do you explain the empty shelves at stores? Do you see this current issue with truckers seeking higher wages and better working conditions as part of the reason?
Well, I think the bigger issue is going in, as Paxton said at the start, we're already as an industry experiencing an 80,000 driver shortage in the trucking industry, and that issue may not go away. We're waiting on the Supreme Court to rule on OSHA's vaccine mandate as it could affect truck drivers. Certainly, the driving profession is one that is solitary in nature, and they operate alone in the trucks, but it's that public interaction that may preclude them from being exempt. So if the Supreme Court rules in favor of the industry and abandons the rule, then that would be good for the industry, good for trucking as a whole. But if they don't, there could be some portions or parts of the industry that may require a vaccine, and drivers in some cases just don't want to get the vaccine and may leave the industry altogether. So that 80,000 number can grow, making this supply chain crisis even more severe.
So David, so you're saying that the Omicron variant how is it impacting truckers right now? And you're saying if a vaccine mandate is implemented, that it would further impact the supply chain crisis?
It could lead to further people leaving the industry. At the start of the pandemic, we were about 60,000 drivers short. Now here we are now, a little over 80,000 drivers short now. So this could get worse if this vaccine mandate does go into effect and affects this industry and its ability to deliver freight. I mean, you're talking about PPE, we're talking about stocking store shelves, emergency supplies for climate, weather conditions and emergencies. These are all issues that the industry is involved in, and these rules and regulations that were referred to earlier can have an even bigger effect on the industry.
Interesting. And Hillary, we heard in Trinity's report that there is a massive impact on retail right now. Some are calling it a labor shortage, but do you think it's more of a shift where people are wanting to work remotely?
Well, I think yes. And what you've also seen, and Natasha, you're totally right about that. They want to work remotely. And also the high-tech industry is far more appealing because don't forget, you have Amazon coming in with higher wages and many high-tech jobs coming in and being able to offer people a better standard of living, a better quality of living. The Wall Street Journal has had extensive articles on this. And AI, of course, is replacing many jobs. So you have people that are re-qualifying, getting qualified to be able to have jobs that give them a better standard of living and a better wage for the same sort of work and less stress. You're finding this not just in retail, but you're finding this also in the restaurant industry. I think what you're going to see happen is actually, they're calling it the Detroit effect. You know, the car industry went through this many years ago where you saw a lot of unions going on strike many years ago, back in the 70s and the 80s. And then what happened? The car industry, whole manufacturing industry brought in a lot of automation. You're seeing that across all sorts of retail, and you're going to see that in shipping, you're going to see that in warehousing, and that's what's going to happen. You're going to see automation and AI take over a lot of the labor jobs because, yes, people are leaving for high-tech jobs and a better quality of life and more high-tech, high-standard, higher-paying jobs.
Yep, we see it happening right now. And Michelle, is there something that can be done by the Biden administration to help curb the inflation being felt all across the country?
I think it's going to be extremely difficult because everything that Hillary and David just talked about, we're having it on steroids because of the pandemic. And now even with a tightening potential policy by the Fed, if you just compare to where we were at, say, in 1980, we are starting now with 0% rates. Back then, we started with more like 7 to 12% rates. So even if we go for, let's say, rate raises and we get to 0.75%, which I don't even think they'll do that much, or 1% versus the rate of inflation that we're seeing because of this sort of perfect storm between labor, supply chain, disease, accommodative policy, more government spending potentially, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then I think that the Biden administration is going to have a really tough time putting this under control. And obviously with midterm elections coming, that could be a real sea change there as well.
And, you know, David, I was wondering if you could expand on a point that Hillary made earlier about all the regulations that truckers are now facing. Can you expand on that?
Well, certainly. We always like to say we're the most regulated, deregulated industry in the world, if you will, and our drivers are the safest, most well-trained drivers faced on the roads today. So when you look at things like a driver's hours of service, our truck drivers aren't just getting in the wheel and driving. They're regulated in the amount of hours they can drive. And as an industry, we're averaging, as an example, about 6.5 hours of drive time per day per driver. And they're regulated to allow 11 hours. So issues like detention time, being held up in the ports, being held up at shippers' facilities are affecting the ability to move freight. So with 6.5 hours of drive time, they're leaving 4.5 hours of unused drive time when those wheels are rolling to deliver freight. That certainly does have an effect on stocking the store shelves. So that's just one instance of that regulation. But there's so many that we would need a longer program just to get into them all. So it's one of those biggest issues that our industry faces. And it's a great industry. It's the front lines of this pandemic, and it supplies this nation without a doubt.
Certainly. Now, panel, we are out of time. Thank you so much for all of your insight.
Thank you.